Well, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are so glad to have you join us today for ADAA's live Q&A, your college mental health packing list. My name is Jolie Busby, and I'm the Education and Training Manager here at ADAA. A little housekeeping for today's session. This webinar is being recorded. Closed captioning and translation are available. Attendees at today's session will receive a link to the recording within 48 hours. This webinar is chat enabled, so we encourage participants to ask questions through the chat feature. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. We have with us Sarah Olivo. Sarah is head of LuMate Academy, the training and public education arm of LuMate Health. She is the co-host of the College is Fine, Everything's Fine podcast, which highlights skills-based therapy strategies for college students to manage typical college pressures. Before joining LuMate, Sarah served on the faculty of NYU Child Study Center and the Weill Cornell Medical Center. She eventually left academia and co-founded City and Country CBT, a boutique private practice in New York. Sarah is a staunch believer in evidence-based psychology and believes everyone should have access to effective mental health care. Her mission at LuMate is to help spread CBT in innovative ways so that more children, teens, and young adults can benefit from skills-based therapy. We also have with us today Michael Detweiler. Michael served for over 20 years as an active duty clinical psychologist in the United States Air Force prior to joining LuMate. He had a prolific career that spanned the globe, working at nearly every level of that organization. As a staff psychologist, he ensured the well-being of troops and their family members, ultimately earning the United States Air Force Psychologist of the Year award. As one of only a handful of child and adolescent clinical psychology specialists, he ensured the delivery of federally mandated special education services to the children of service members living overseas. He was a driving force in the planning and execution of the first US-UK military mental health symposium, lauded by top British and American commanders. Michael deployed twice in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. In other words, he knows a few things about skills you need to prepare for new, intimidating situations. So again, welcome to our presenters today.
Thank you.
Hi, it's great to be here.
So looking for some questions in our chat. Let's see if we have any right away. And if not, I will encourage everyone to go ahead and place their questions in the chat. But I can kick us off with one that I think will be of value. And so to our presenters, if you had to choose a top 3 list of things you wanted college students to know how to handle their first semester, what would it be?
Top 3, hey, you can give us a number. So I think what I like to think of is a few different categories. And in a way, I'm going to do a little cheating because I'm basing this on some of the principles of CBT, the kind of model that we go by, which is how to manage feelings in your body so that they're not impacting you in a way that's unhelpful, paying attention to your thoughts and how those sort of filters are guiding maybe your behaviors in a way that isn't always effective. And then what kind of actions you can take in order to be basing your decisions on values and kind of finding your compass versus an emotion that's getting in the way. So I think one of the things that can happen when you go to college is everything is so new. You're coming in from most likely an environment, a home where a lot of things have been decided for you. Your friendships have been somewhat steady, hopefully, and you've known a lot of your world for a long time. So having a beginner's mindset when you go in, sort of going in and saying, I'm going to pretend like I don't necessarily have an idea of what's coming. I'm going to try to take what I think of as the college experience and and I'm going to put that to the side, and not a lot of when I talk to the college students I work with or through our podcast have said, we actually have these like video images of what college should be like. And when it's not exactly like that, it's hard. So I think going in and saying, all right, college experience has sort of an infinite number of ways to handle it. I'm just going to go and be curious. So having a beginner's mindset, having ways to keep your body steady. For some people, that's continuing to find or continuing to get to a place of studying their mind through a yoga practice or an exercise practice. It can be exercise, but it can also just be the ability to take some really good basic breaths, just to pay attention to the tension that you're holding in your body and seeing if there's a way to offset that through either body movement or relaxation. And then last but not least, and this is the hardest, is something called opposite action. And I will say it's a complicated skill to convince people is a skill, right? It's essentially saying, we have action urges when we're anxious. We want to avoid things. We have action urges when we're sad. We want to withdraw. And those are really normal. And in college, sometimes you have to say, okay, I know I'm feeling afraid, but that might be a trigger for me to try to act and approach a situation. College is sort of ripe for avoidance. You don't always have to go to class. No one's paying as much attention to you. You don't have to leave your dorm. You can get food delivered. So I think that knowing that you can pay attention to your longer term goals, like how you want to be as a student at the end of those 4 years, how will you have wanted to act? What would you have done to make this the best experience for you? And have your actions be based on that and not feelings in the moment. So kind of acting opposite to some of those action urges. So those are my three.
I love it. I agree with everything Sarah just said.
Good.
Obviously,
If you disagreed,
therapy.
we'd have a problem.
No, no, no. You're speaking in broad terms, right? We focus on what you think, what you feel, and what you do. And I'm not going to step on your toes. I'm going to expand upon what you talked about and kind of take it outside the clinical literature just a little bit. So if you look broadly at the educational data and the research that's out there, they generally broadly define what is a key to student success is something they call student engagement. And they've found really kind of 7 categories of what are those behaviors of those specific effective educational practices that really kind of influence a student's learning. And so they're things like student-faculty contact, cooperation among other students, something they call active learning, which we can get into here in a little bit, getting and receiving prompt feedback, the amount of time that you spend on tasks, educational tasks, completing them, respect for diverse talents and ways of thinking. And then my personal favorite that I'm ready to talk about for a lot is having appropriately high expectations for what school is. So an easy way to summarize all of that is expectation management. Those would be my answers there.
Yeah. I think so many people go to college with a preview in their mind of what they expect it to look like. And when it's not perhaps exactly like that, or it is like that, but you're not reacting the way you expected. I think it can throw people for a loop. So what we know is that the most common feeling that freshmen will have collaboratively is excitement and loneliness. And if people are going into school and not feeling lonely, there could be reasons for that, right? They might know a lot of people already. Certainly, I have a nephew he went to his local state school and he's with a bunch of his buddies. And, but even he said it's a little strange. It's a different type of social that I'm used to. And the act of having to start fresh with so many people. In fact, I like it when people allow themselves to feel a little lonely because it means they're not going in too quickly or acting against some sort of instinct on someone's character. But it also means having to tolerate that and not personalize it, not say there's something wrong with me. I think so many people go in and expect and see other people acting fine, which is, the riff on the college podcast that I do. And so they assume that other people feel fine. So when they don't feel okay, they think something's wrong with them. So a big part of what I try to do is to normalize that when you go into college, the richer your life is, right? The more relationships you have, the more passion or that you give to something, by definition, that leads to more of all the emotions we have. Certainly when I became a parent, there was an incredible amount of love and excitement about that, and more stress, more frustration. I felt those things more too. And I think that having college students realize that by doing something that feels obviously very important to you, by definition means you're going to experience all of the human emotions, the ones we like and the ones we don't like, and to try to normalize that as much as possible. Expectation management, that's perfectly said, Mike.
Right. I mean, the phrase that's been thrown around in literature is called the freshman myth. And it's kind of this idea of, the disillusionment that they feel when they first go to college. You have this myth of what you think college is supposed to be. So I'm thinking of an interesting study that came out from Harvard a while back. I don't know that it was necessarily conducted at Harvard, but they looked at the expectations of rising freshmen headed to college and then compared it a year later to actual reality. And what they found was that there was a general underestimation of how of student performance in that first year, both good and bad. So for example, when they asked them questions like, how many of you expect to get at least a B average? How many of you expect to join a club or a team or a fraternity or some sort of, positive social gathering? The vast majority of students underestimated how likely they would be to actually do that. But what's interesting is when they looked at negatively valenced things, how many of you expect to have a decline in functioning severe enough that you'll have to go talk to a counselor? Again, they generally underestimated how many of them would actually need that. So I think, by and large, everybody's college experience is going to be different. It really depends on whether you're going to a 2-year community college or a 4-year university, what your major ultimately is. But the one thing that everyone brings to the table that, a parent or a friend can do is help with expectation management and those, reminding us that, you've been kind of coasting along here, and the kids you were going to school with in high school were the same ones you went to middle school with, and probably the same ones you went to elementary school with, and you're in a routine and it's easy. And now you're going to go someplace else, someplace new. You won't have all the same support systems, and you're going to have to start over from scratch and make all of those connections yourself. And so, kind of reminding folks that that's an active attempt you have to make. No one will passively come and meet you, right? So sometimes you have to put yourself out there and get to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. When you're ready.
No, I was just going to say, I hosted in the chat, like, please pepper us with questions. We're happy. Mike and I could talk all day.
Oh, and one just came in. So thank you, Natalie. How do you suggest encouraging quieter, shyer students to get out there?
Right. So get out there. That is a really good question, because I think I would handle this in a lot of ways. If someone was coming to me and this were my client and a parent, I would say, okay, there's a few things to start with. One is, what are your expectations and hopes versus your child's, your teens, your future college student? Because I do think that sometimes, I'm not saying this is the case, I love to get shy kids out there. But before I go there, I do want to say that I have seen a mismatch sometimes in the level of weight that people put on, having a lot more social interactions. We do know that the quality of interactions can often beat quantity. And so some people might be on the quieter side, but if they're thriving and they have close connections and they're able to find people they do feel comfortable with, that could be okay for them. So one is sometimes just managing to say, I don't always believe that some of the quieter students are struggling as much. They might be really doing okay. That said, obviously, if they're struggling with, they want to be out there, or you think, I do think that sometimes kids who are more anxious or shy have a lot of what I think of as like the excuse generating machine. They'll be like, well, I'm okay. Like I'm just too mature for these people, or they find sort of reasons to be quiet in a social situation that, is quite different from how they present at home and what their real goals are. Then I typically like to start with, okay, two things. One is getting out there can feel, um, while you and I know what that means, they might not really know what to do with that. So what does getting out there look like for you versus for them? If I'm watching your kiddo, your future freshman, if I'm watching them, or your current college student, if I'm watching them get out there, what would I see them doing? That's a lot of what I am working on with folks, and Mike too. We're sort of behavior change experts. So we're thinking, okay, if I'm seeing this happen, what would that look like? And it could be having them say, if I could take off my worry, right? Like I could just be like, whew, it's gone. What would I be doing? If I had a magic wand and it was gone, what would I be doing? Which is a good way of saying what do they want versus what we kind of might think of. And then, all right, so it'd be making closer connections with people in their dorm. Great. What does that look like? Asking open-ended questions, right? Not staying in your room, but instead staying in common areas. Looking into clubs where there's a common and shared interest so that there's an easy way to make conversation. These are just examples, right? But what are some things we could see them doing? And then what is reinforcing ways to reinforce that idea to start maybe at a manageable level, and then grow from there. So that's a quick answer. Mike, if you have anything to add, certainly add it. And if you want me to go further with something I've said, please add it in the chat.
Yeah, no, I would agree. The only thing that I use the analogy of acting, where pretend you're an actor, and for the next hour, pretend you're in a play and you're playing a popular student. You know, how much you think, how much you act, right? So to kind of get you out of that mindset of your own persona, you're just playing a role. Look at what happens. What we know from the research again is that proximity is a huge factor behind the friendships that we make. And it's simply the number of people, the more often you bump into someone, the more likely you are to bump into someone, the more likely you are to develop a friendship. And so I throw that out there and I tell our teens, use that to your advantage. Pay attention of who's in your local area, whether that's your dorm or on a particular class that you're in. Who do you typically bump into often, right? And there's your opportunity to meet someone and develop kind of a friendship, start off a conversation, right? So some of the best conversations you have are when you're waiting in the laundry room for your clothes to dry. You have no other place to be and you're just sitting there. Everybody's in the same situation. It's kind of a low threat environment. So that's kind of a common one. I'll also give a shout out to a lot of colleges understand this and have kind of structured schedules and programs around this. So when I think back to my undergraduate days, it started with an orientation weekend before school started. And really the whole intent of that was largely to get you kind of acclimated to the school environment under a low threat environment when the other students weren't there yet. And giving you an opportunity to bump into people in unstructured times so that you can develop friendships and start those communication patterns. And I think so teaching your kids and your students to look out for those opportunities, most of the time they're just not being taken advantage of. So
yeah, a good life hack is like people like to bond over things they don't like. So a quick and dirty trick is just to find something that people are bugged by, and then bond with people over, I'm always like, hey, if it's me and I'm the professor and you don't like me, bond over it. Go find somebody else, I made mad. And then, I'm happy to be the foil. I want to get to the next question, which I think is a really great one. And it's about routines, knowing that there's some students who have either with help or through just the natural course of their school system, their family home life, et cetera, like they have been able to either build routines or the routines have been there for them. One of the things that I think I made a little joke about it in our intro is we hear a lot from college students who say like, actually having this much free time is overwhelming and I don't know how to manage it. And so instead of using it well, I tend to be sort of deer in headlights about it. I kind of freeze and then I don't do much. By the way, I want to take a quick pause to say, this is my microphone, in case you're wondering what this alien force is. It's kind of weirding me out that I wanted to tell you what it was so it wouldn't weird you out. So that being said, I do think that getting ahead of the free time and trying to say, all right, you're going to have to build your own routines. They might want your help. I always say, you're not, it's a good way to start the communication. Like, hey, we've done this in our family, or I've helped you this much, or schools kind of did this, and that's going to go away. So what are the ways you could start to bridge what you already know? And I always think with a incoming college student, and what we know, that works for you, the more they buy in, the more they're likely to use it. And to say, all right, so if you have classes, from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Tuesdays and Thursdays, and you have classes from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Wednesdays, Mondays and Wednesdays, let's block out your time a little bit. What routines can you start to think about as you get there? But I do think it's important to kind of, what I always think of with these types of things is there's not a skill probably being practiced unless there's some sort of physical manipulation of something. For instance, block it out in a calendar. So what are some things they can write down or have a list or put in their phone as a reminders for that? But so I could keep going, but yeah, that sort of expansive free time, people tend to like it for a little bit, and then they get a little overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, I like to remind people that because it's such a radical change in schedule and setting and routine, it's a perfect opportunity to kind of reset and be mindful about what routines you are creating, right? Before they really kind of take foothold and you get into a rut with them. And so, as a CBT therapist, I'm constantly reminding folks that oftentimes it comes down to the basics, right? What did mom teach you to do when you were in kindergarten? Good diet. What are all the things that we sacrifice when we get stressed out? If you're like most people, it's sleep, it's diet, it's exercise, right? So being mindful and intentional about creating routines specifically around that, right? Starting from an expectation of how much sleep will I need? I think it's not unintentional that colleges offer meal plans for this age range because meals are ready and available and prepared for them. So it's one less thing that they have to worry about doing for themselves, right? But those other things like sleep and self-care and exercise, how can you start by working them into your schedule and then working the rest of your schedule, I think is an important thing for them to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah. One of the things that I hear a lot from, this is sort of a conversation that goes around students. It's like their inside joke. It's like you can study, you can sleep, or you can socialize, but you can only do 2 of the 3. And that's that's a joke. And there are probably times of the year where that's genuinely true. And that's fine. College is not steady. There's something really great about that fact, right? It allows people to expand in really good ways away from a routine that's given to them so they can get to know a new routine. However, I do think that I try to tell students also, yes, maybe during exams, right? Or maybe a couple of weekends here and there, but for the most part, 7 days a week, maybe 5 of those days, depending on the student, right? You can get all 3 in. And if you notice, and I found that the students who by senior year, what they'll do is they'll notice, oh, I got off and I'm only doing 2. So how can I get back to 1? So that's another framework that's helpful, which is to say that these are some of the competing needs of a college student, and how can you work your routine around building in all of those things. And I would say, sleep also, yes, but in terms of eating as well, we have a worksheet that I created called we know how to make you a mess, right? Like if you want to say hey, I'd really love to be a mess, we know how to do it. Don't move, don't eat well, don't sleep, and don't take space from screens. I'll share a link to that tip sheet if you'd like to share it with your college students. So that is something where it's a lot of times people come into me and say, oh, I'm so upset, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, how is your sleep? How's your eating? And it's all off the table. And I'm like, well, I can only do so much. I can't, if all the sleep and eating and everything is funky, like, of course your emotions are going to get into the mix here. So that's a huge thing. And I just want to also go to Jennifer, if it's okay for us to transition. I'm trying to pay attention to time and want to get all these questions answered. She says, I coach students to transition from their high school world into the new world of college. What are the key adulting skills or practical skills that you've seen students struggle with? Mike, I'm happy to take this one unless you have a really go-to answer, because I have an opinion.
I think we'll both probably agree. So go for it.
Well, there's practical skills. We've talked a lot about practical skills so far, but I actually find the one thing that kids struggle with the most is managing relationships that they need to manage. And what I mean by that is that they have the opportunity to speak to a professor and get to know them, but they don't always go to them for help, or they struggle with a roommate situation and ask to transfer instead of not. So managing some of those relationships that for understandable reasons, they might not have had to navigate that as much so far. And it can feel like a real swing to have some of those interpersonal skills, like going up to someone and having the balance between, giving too much to a friendship or right, can shifting into being too rigid and not hearing the other person's side. So that's something I'm often working with folks on too, is to say, okay, you're your own advocate now. And you might not have built that muscle yet. So let's start to get ahead of that. A lot of times before people go to school, I'll ask them some I'll kind of give them some anecdotal situations, be like, how would you manage that? And then if it feels like they're off a bit, I'll say, all right, let's role play. I want you to send me an email pretending I'm a professor and you're asking for an extension, or I want you to say, I'm struggling in this class. How, we kind of practice some of those social kind of approach behaviors.
Yeah, I was going to focus on sleep. Again, I'm back to basics. So I think one of the biggest tips that I find I'm frequently giving college-bound, college-age kids is just managing their expectations about sleep. And the perception being that if I pull an all-nighter, it's more likely to lead to success on this test. And just reminding them things like, sleep, among other things, helps consolidate memory. You need sleep to kind of function highly. So pointing out obvious things like that. What are the things you would do and would not do before a really important job interview? Most people would probably not answer that by saying, I would stay up the night before, the whole night cramming, and show up looking tired and not rested, to just try to squeak through any way I could. And then you say, okay, well, but then why would you approach all of those preparatory experiences that lead up to that key job interview that you're looking to get in the same way, right? So that's one. Sleep is a big one that can really interfere with mood and with learning. And then the other one I would throw out there is learning, giving yourself permission to ask for help, learning when it's time to ask for help. So kind of getting out of your own way of feeling like adjustment means I have to handle all of this on my own and figure it out all on my own. And kind of teaching teens and young adults to recognize early and start to ask for questions early. I would add that.
I want to look and see. Okay, so we have ideas for neurodivergent students who struggle with organizational skills, time management skills, etc. So obviously this is a wide range. Yeah, it's a wide range of needs. But what I would say is this: once your student is in school, depending on their level of dependence, some kids are neurodivergent, which means they've enough that they have already set up a person on campus to be a guide between home and college. So great. But there are things to know, which is that typically, unless that has been a prearranged, once your kiddo is in school, they have to approve of your help officially when it comes to certain administrative tasks, etc. So I think knowing what the school arrangements are ahead of time and getting in touch with them beforehand, if you can, to say, you know, my incoming student will need some help with this, and agreeing and working with your high schooler to just to sort of have a plan for how much help they want from you, and then to create a system before you get there of working with, you know, again, most colleges have programs very specifically. I have yet to have a college that I've worked with or a student who I've known who's gone to one who has not had a way for students to go and get academic help and support and needs, so that they can have someone on campus who's checking in, teaching those skills as they go, or holding them accountable to a standard that everyone has agreed is reasonable. So that's really what I would say, is find your connection on campus first, get ahead of it, and say, and if you feel strongly that you need to be involved, that conversation should happen before they're there, so that any sort of official paperwork that you might have to sign, or that your student and the school might have to sign, is set up. I know we have a few more questions, so I'm just keep on going down. How should kids prepare for living with a stranger or a roommate? I know, I'm like, we should do a separate podcast on that, because the relationship part is really tough. I think if they haven't, you know, sometimes if people have had siblings, it's a matter of saying, all right, you kind of know what to do a little bit. And there's some social pressure to act a certain way that will allow them to be able to share space and tolerate that. That they know they can't, you know, scream at the person like they might scream at their brother or their sister. But I do think that when it comes to a roommate, there's some, you know, part of this depends, right? On the one hand, you might have the student who has been an only child their whole life. That was me. Right? I was like, oh, what do I do now? And so they might need some just basic tips on, like, what does it take to be a good roommate? I mean, there's YouTube clips on, like, okay, if the trash is topped off, you take it out. Like, what are some good roommate skills? It could be, on the other hand, that you might have somebody who is, you know, shy. And so I think that part of it is sort of assessing what you think the potential obstacles could be, and then going through and doing some problem solving around that. Okay, you know, start to have a conversation ahead of time with them, being like, what would you do if, you know, you didn't like your roommate? Or what would you do if the student, you know, there are people who are like, oh my gosh, my roommate, I'm like sleeping on the couch because my roommate's always hooking up. Like, how would you navigate some of those relationship difficulties? And so going through and being like, okay, what are some solutions you could have? And oftentimes with things like this, a lot of it is just conversation and having a sort of an assessment of, like, okay, here's a few things that could come up. How would you manage it? You might be really happily surprised that they know ahead of time, or that they've already worked this out with their friends, you know, so they have a whole nother set of supports with them. And if you know their friends and they're talking about it and figuring it out with them, that's good news. You know, they might have figured that out. And then sort of getting maybe a little ahead of being like, if you don't like your roommate, you know, like, how we know that you need to call me, and like, what are the things that we know is like, okay, I've tried it all and this is just too much. This is genuinely outside the scope of just needing to talk about it with my roommate, and knowing ahead of time what those red flags would be. Okay.
Yeah, most of it boils down to communication, whether you're talking about, you know, romantic relationships or professional relationships or a roommate relationship. You know, 9 times out of 10, when you're seeing challenges with it, it's a breakdown in communication. And so teaching folks to kind of those polite and pro-social but assertiveness skills, and discussions about expectations about how you're going to handle things, I think is very important. I think it's also an opportunity to point out what we often talk about in therapy with our families, Sarah, which is it's a prime opportunity to take a look at parental accommodation, and to what degree that you as a parent are getting involved, and because of a genuine desire to want to help, but maybe by doing so are taking away an opportunity for your teen to kind of problem solve and practice some of those young adult skills kind of on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
yeah. there are a couple of questions about, we're getting a lot about like neurodivergent students, and we're also getting some that I think could lend to more problematic social anxiety. So I wanted to take a bit of time for going out. So the kind of the typical college student packing list, and when do you know that there are some red flags for your socially anxious or quiet student who struggled to make those connections. So I think that if you and or the student start to feel like the loneliness that we talked about is really outside the scope of typical, right? And then you also have, and your child and you've seen them struggle, and they might have either some, some potentially social skills deficits if they have sort of a specific social skills need, and they need some coaching and training around handling that, or they might have anxiety, social anxiety. We know that kids who are socially anxious don't necessarily have poor ability to communicate or some real difficulty understanding social interactions and so on and so forth. It's just a fear that they'll be judged, but their social skills are actually really, really fine, So I think that it partly depends, right, on what we're talking about here. If it's somebody who is struggling with a communication deficit that might be defined as being, whether it's mildly on the spectrum or just some temperament aspects to how they interact with people, and you've seen this happen time and time again, this is one of those things where I want to, first of all, acknowledge for parents what it's like to not have control over what their college students do and how those college students are treated. I do think that, and I am someone who can put myself in this basket, right? It's sort of like, I try not to, because I know the literature and parent accommodation, but the urge is there. It's like, okay, how can I create a situation where my child won't have to experience unnecessary pain? And so part of the skill set that we'd say you need to pack as a parent is finding supports if you need it, or kind of seeing the difference between ways you can truly set your child or your student up for success, and also knowing where you don't have any control. And the more you try to help, the harder it is for you without really changing how the experience is for your students. So I just want to validate how hard that can be. And
Absolutely.
if you feel that the person is has struggled before, but have there been people that tend to be kind or they can connect with? So going back and saying, okay, we know a few things now from your high school experience. What are the qualities of people that you found you want to be around, and that they want to be around you? What does that look like? How did we figure that out? What are the qualities that you want in a friend? And sometimes I'll even have someone do like a friend map for me of character traits. I'll be like, okay, what is sort of like must have, what is not so much, and what is you could give or take, and then I think that if it becomes something where you really know that they're going to be isolated and that's going to lead to potentially depression, again, that's where get ahead, see what the counseling support is, because sometimes it's outside the bounds of parent support. They need actual therapy or on the ground supports in order to manage their college experience. And plenty of families understandably say, we're actually incorporating the support of the school and the way they handle student needs into our decision around where to send our child. There are certainly, well, I mean, obviously, if you're in one of the states that we serve at LuMate, we certainly work with people via telehealth, which is a really nice, friendly way for college students to, if they don't have a car, and, they can find a nice private space that we could see them easily if it feels that way. But mostly that there could be some things that just need that next level of support. If they're not leaving their room, if their mood is starting to shift, if you're hearing them talk to you, but they're not being really specific about their day or who they're talking to, you're not hearing those specifics, it might be time to, the next time they come home or call, be like, let's get a real picture of what's going on here. Yeah.
Yeah. The hard part for neurodivergent populations is, one, this is one of the most challenging transitions for them to make, right? They're people who tend to thrive in settings where there's routine, and now you're changing all of this up. And it also happens to come at a time when you are finding they may be aging out of some of the IEP or 504 related services that they would normally get through the school system. So it's doubly hard. I think, it's hard to come up with a generic answer to it. I think different colleges differ in how much they get it and how many services they offer to neurodivergent populations. And that's part of the prep that I would recommend people do before sending the kid off, looking at what's available and what's needed. I think when and where you tend to see them, it's getting better, right? More and more neurodiverse kids are ending up going to college, and that's great. So you see these little grassroots social support networks popping up in colleges, but they vary. And I think in my experience, they tend to be heavily focused towards academic success and studying and structuring an academic schedule, and not necessarily so much of a social schedule. But in that case, I would think that's where it's important to kind of have those supplemental supports through agencies that are not associated with the school, whether that be ADAA or NAMI or the Autism Society of America. I'm always reminding families that kids on the spectrum tend to have a restricted range of interests, but they still have interests, and sometimes that's the key into it, right? So they may not have as a wide breadth of groups that they attend or hobbies that they have, but the one or two that they have, they really get into. And that's like the anchor for their social network. And so, again, it's hard to come up with a specific recommendation for that, but I would say looking at what's available to supplement what might be available at the school with those kind of social networks.
There are two more questions in the chat. I know we're running up against some time, so if some folks might have need to hop off or not, but if Mike, if you have time, I have time, I would love to
Sure.
answer those,
Yep,
try to answer those
absolutely.
two questions. One has to do with how can I help my student, my teen, have a more flexible mindset, and the other is around boundary setting and friend expectations, etc. So I will say that in terms of flexible mindset, Mike, I mean, I feel like I just keep on jumping in. I'm happy to
No,
kick
go
this.
ahead, because I'm ready to take the other one. So we'll
Oh,
share.
gotcha. Okay, perfect. So, well, one, again, going back to, especially at this point, how to help them have a more flexible mindset. I wish I could say, like, here's a magic wand and try this and it'll work. I think one thing you have going for you is that college is about to do a lot of the work for you. Some of the things that you might have struggled with, right? Ways you've tried and ways the school might have worked with or against you so far. College is about to force a bit of flexible thinking. So the one thing I would say is you might do nothing and have a person who, because of maturity and increasing experience, is able to have a more flexible mindset. If they're about to leave, and again, when I hear questions like this, I'm thinking there's probably been a lot of things you've tried already. Right? I'm just going to assume that this is something where you've tried and not much has happened, or maybe or you could just be noticing it and wanting to get ahead of it for them. I think that modeling it yourself is the best you can do right now, and being less. What we know is when people kind of push, the response by nature is for the person to back away. So the more you sort of push flexible thinking, especially for a potentially rigid thinker, the more they're going to double down on their perspective. One of the things we know about language is that once someone has voiced their opinion based on a kind of a back and forth, whether they, the more they say it out loud, the more they actually get entrenched. So what I try to say to families a lot of times is if you want something to shift for your kiddo, it actually might be doing the opposite of what you want. If you kind of say, here's a way to think flexibly, they might naturally be like, nope, I won't. Even if internally they were already kind of getting there. Now they're going to be like, I won't do it. I happen to have a son who I love him to pieces as a rigid thinker. And like, he'll even say to me sometimes, like, you know what? I was starting to think that way, but now that you said it, I don't want to do it. I'm like, well, thanks a lot for voicing my worst fears. So, but you being able to just model it, your kids are watching you, right? They're what they say to you and what they're seeing you do. If they see you be flexible, they are pulling it in. I see people and kids come to me, and they say, "Yeah, I kind of noticed this, and it meant a lot to me." They would never give their parent that joy, obviously, but they do see that. So I think for the next several months, the more you can be like, "Huh, that's one way to think about it. I kind of thought it like this," and just plant the seed and then let it go, and then let experiences in college and excuse me, potentially some hard lessons do the rest. All right, Mike, kick
Okay.
it off to
Yeah.
you.
So, Jennifer, do we address the personal
Same.
boundaries with the friend expectation conversation? So yes, absolutely. And I'll take it one step further. I also address it with parents. So, I'm in a cohort of friends whose kids are all kind of growing up and about to head off to college. And it's fun to be on the other side and to see how the parents struggle with the personal boundaries that they give their kids, right? And so I think, yes, there's never a wrong time to have a conversation about personal boundaries, right? I mean, the bottom line is you need to feel physically and emotionally safe. And you deserve to feel physically and emotionally safe in your own room, in your relationships with other people, and your immediate environment, right? And so I don't think it's a bad question to have. I find myself increasingly telling parents and all of my friends, yeah, there need to be boundaries there, but you also need to be honest. So, a good example of one that my friend stumbled over kind of on her own was to say to her adult son, listen, I know you're going to go off and you're going to do your own thing, and you don't need me hovering and trying to, monitor you 24/7. But that said, so I will not contact you. I will wait for you to call home and tell us how you're doing, right? However, that said, I need you to understand that if I don't hear from you at least once a month, I'm going to worry, right? So somewhere in between those kind of left and right boundaries are very, very helpful. And she has found that that worked a lot better than the parents who literally monitor their child's location on, the web tracking apps and the Find My Phone apps, and know that so and so didn't come home last night, and then forcing that conversation, right? And so, yes, I always do address those personal boundaries with everyone there. So.
Jolie, I know we're at time, so I just sent a link to a website where we are building our college library. It's a little piecemeal now just because we're switching to a new platform, so uploading, etc. But I can also make sure that some of the things we talked about today do land on there as a potential follow-up for some of these skills on boundary setting with roommates and so on and so forth. We do have specific guidelines and things that can help in terms of skills use for those things. So I'll make sure those get up there ASAP if you want to just bookmark that, and I'll start to upload some of those skills and tips for you guys.
Well, thank you so much for doing that. And I hope everyone's taking a note. After our session completes today, we do have some resources that you shared with us that I'll be sharing with our attendees today. And also just wanted to say that I believe this session resonated with everyone in attendance today. Great questions, great answers. Thank you so much today for Sarah Olivo and Michael Detweiler, our presenters from LuMate Health. ADA really appreciates our partnership with LuMate. So with that, I'd like to share just a little bit about ADAA for our attendees today. Essentially, the Anxiety and Depression Association of America works to prevent, treat, and cure anxiety disorders and depression through the alignment of science, treatment, and education. We invite you all to explore our website at adaa.org, where you can find resources such as future upcoming webinars, blog posts and personal stories, self-help books and publications. And of course, please consider subscribing to our free monthly e-newsletter, Triumph. And with that, our session is complete today. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks again to our presenters, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
It's been great. Love this audience.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you much.